everyone, today I'm going to be recording a watercolour poppy painting tutorial. This is part of my 8-week watercolour series which you can find. Follow the link down below for more information, and yeah, let's get to it. So to begin with, for this class I made sure all my materials of course were in front of me. This includes 2 jars of water, obviously the watercolour paint, palette for mixing and A4 paper along with my paintbrushes. I also used some washi tape to line the paper. This is completely optional. All it does is give a nice crisp clean edge without ripping the paper, so that might be something to think about before you start this painting, but again, like I say, completely optional. You don't have to have this at hand. So to begin with, for this piece I pre-mixed my colours. I used 2 shades of red for this poppy painting. I wanted a really dark red and a lighter red, so they are still the same colour but contrasting in shade. So for one I added just a little bit of water for the pre-mixing, and for the second colour I added far more water so that you could really see again that contrast between the 2 different shades. I also really lightly drew 6 circles on the paper. I did this to map in where I wanted the centre of each poppy to be, just so I had a rough idea in terms of overlapping. If you wanted poppies closer together, that's something you can now incorporate. It's just having a general plan that's easy to follow, knowing where you want each flower to be. So for each poppy it was very important to focus on the layering process today. So as you can see, I only put down a couple of petals for each flower. So for the first one I focused more on that petal at the top, and for the rest did something slightly different each time. So for the second poppy that I painted, there's 2 petals coming out the sides, things like that. I wanted to explore the different shapes and petal sizes that we can incorporate into this piece. For a couple of the poppies as well, I really wanted there to be that stereotypical poppy shape where everything, it almost has that perfect look to it. The petals are very similar in size, the perspective's very head on. So I painted a couple of poppies opposite each other in terms of where the centre of the poppy would be, so the petals aren't touching. And then we can fill this in later once these have dried with that layering process that I've just mentioned. I also really wanted to focus on shade today, so I drew a little arrow to start with. You might not have seen, it's very light, can barely see it on camera. Drew a little arrow pointing down in the top right hand corner of my page, just to remind myself that I want the light to be coming down. This is a really good way to practice how light falls. So I used the darker colour on each of the petals. Once I'd gone in with the lighter shade, then use that darker colour on the bottom of each petal, whether that be more towards the centre, on the outside of the petals, as long as it was more towards the bottom. Just dotted a little bit of that in there, blended it together, and that means that you can have that consistent shadow throughout, where it's light on the top and it gradually gets darker the further down each petal you go. And then once these petals have dried, you can go back to the first flower that we were working on and do the same kind of thing really, but this time overlapping the petals, as should have allowed enough time to dry enough so that it doesn't all bleed together. If not though, I'd maybe leave it just a little bit longer, maybe 10-15 minutes, come back to it, and then you can start the layering process, and you don't need to worry about all these colours merging and creating a blotchy effect. You can really distinctly see each petal. I think this poppy painting as well really allows you to practice different perspectives. So for the first couple of poppies that I painted, the petals are predominantly larger towards the top in terms of where the circle is in the centre. So it's all about them being bigger on the top, and then you've got more of an overlap towards the bottom and they're slightly thinner, mainly because flowers typically point upwards towards sunlight. That's just naturally how flowers work. So I really wanted to try and replicate that with having the bigger petals, and then it's almost like the bottom petals are pointing upwards just that little bit more. also noticed that I use a lot more of that darker red towards the bottom of each flower, again to focus on the light and it coming down from the top. So the light would hit the petals on top of each flower first and it will gradually get darker, especially if the petals at the top are casting shadows to anything below it. So that's just something to bear in mind for each particular flower that you paint. So at this stage it's going back and forth between flowers now. I think it's good to have a little bit of a flow to it, so I started with my first flower, worked my way around and came back to that first flower. Just allows that little bit more drying time and then you can create them layers of petals. I also think it's important to note that with poppies, I know I tried very hard to make the petals thicker than normal, just because with a poppy flower that is how they look. I think that's that clear distinction between this flower. It really makes it special. So the wider each petal is, the better. And with that overlapping, you don't need to worry about petals being too big. You can just overlap them. It's not like it's taken away from anything, which is nice. I then went on to add a rich yellow to the centre of each of the poppies. You want to be careful if your paper has not fully dried, this will bleed together, so I'd maybe leave it a little bit longer just to allow that drying time, as there is normally a clear distinction between the red and the dark centre with poppies. Then went in with a earth green for these stems, and with a little bit more drying time went in with a nice dark rich brown to fill in the centre of each of these flowers. And that is essentially it for this poppy painting. It's super easy, it's just taking your time, breaking down all the little elements and adding in the layers. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for more YouTube content. See you soon, bye!